All right, everyone. Well, thanks for joining. Super excited for today's webinar. We have Aurelian joining us here from the Dermalogica team, here to talk about his experiences with Measured and how he's brought incrementality into his organization and how he's used it to improve the efficiency of the company overall. A couple quick introductions. My name is Alex Lawrence. I'm a VP and client partner here at Measured. I've worked with many of our brands, including the Dermalogica team, for about 4 years now. Aurelian, I'll let you just do a quick introduction of yourself and kind of who you are.
Yes, good morning or afternoon, I guess, for many of you. I'm Aurelian Lee, global CEO of Dermalogica. And that's a picture of me with a lot less hair than I have today, which suggests that either it's AI generated or just a while back. We're a global skincare company, professional. We actually started out as an educational institute, teaching therapists how to do better treatments. We basically a university. We still teach 100,000 therapists a year, so it makes us a bit of a different business. But then we're also available, let's say, in the States through, for example, Sephora, Amazon, Ulta. We're the number one prestige brand in skincare for Ulta, for example. So a big global business working in, we can't count all the countries, but we got 50 major countries and another 38 other ones. So quite a lot.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, a very complex business with some unique aspects on the professional skin therapist side as well. In terms of today, what we're planning to cover, there's a few topics here. So the first is, some of you may not be as familiar with incrementality and what it actually is. So we'll talk about incrementality as a concept and why it matters. We'll then spend a bulk of our time today talking about how executives can use incrementality and better tie media investment into financial impact or driving profit for the business. We'll talk about how Aurelian and the team has actually taken and operationalized incrementality and brought it into the broader organization, and some interesting observations and results from doing this over the years. Finally, we'll close out with a Q&A. Please, throughout the session, you can utilize the Q&A feature within Zoom, and we'll pick up those questions at the end of the session today. So we'll just jump right in here. For those of you who are not familiar with Measured has been around for 8 years. We are, well, we would think we're at least unique in the sense that we're a holistic measurement solution combining a media mix model with incrementality, all brought together with a forward-looking optimization engine. We work with over 160 brands and have managed and tested and optimized billions of dollars of media spend over the years. So that is who Measured is. In terms of what incrementality is, so incrementality really is the true impact of your media investment on the business. And so it ties media spend to financial impact. What it does fundamentally is reduces the decision or bias that comes from last click attribution or multiple platforms taking credit for the same conversion, and it helps brands eliminate and reallocate wasted spend. What we have found and Measured is that platform reported ROAS numbers generally overstate the incremental impact by about 2.5x. And you can see here in this chart across beauty and CPG brands that we work with, the relationship between platform reported ROAS in blue and the actual incremental ROAS here in orange. This is based on benchmark data from our clients, and you can see there's obviously a dramatic drop off. What this means for you, as someone running a brand or running media for a brand, is that the decisions that you would make by relying on these two different data sets would be fundamentally different. And if you simply trust the platforms to guide your decision making, you will likely land at a suboptimal place. And we'll talk about some real examples of that today. In terms of how we calculate incrementality, so we just talked about platform reported numbers being unreliable. The lower funnel campaigns that are closer to the point of conversion tend to get more credit than they should, just as a function of last click or in-platform reporting, whereas the upper funnel campaigns tend to get less credit than they should as conversions happen outside of whatever defined look back window is set up. in the platform. And this really compounds as you start to layer in multiple different types of platforms. So Facebook, Google, TikTok, Pinterest. As someone moves in market and becomes identified as being in market, all of these platforms have built their algorithms to optimize conversion rate. And someone who has been to a site, for example, is a great signal that, hey, we should send them an ad because they're likely to convert. And all of these, mid to low funnel type campaigns start competing for that conversion, and it becomes very difficult on a platform basis to actually strip apart that noise. We arrive at an adjustment factor, which is basically an exchange rate that lets you eliminate that platform bias and the double or triple counting that occurs within the platforms to translate the platform number into an incremental ROAS number. And that percent that you see here, the adjustment factor, isn't a good or bad thing on its own. It's a means to get to an incremental efficiency metric here that you'll see on the right. And so that number can be above 100% if a platform is underreporting. So things like TikTok or YouTube or TV tend to get less credit, than they should, or it can be below 100% if a platform is over-reporting. So things like brand search or retargeting tend to get more credit than they should. We land at this number using a combination of geo-testing that then calibrates a media mix model across the full cross-channel media mix. And so that's an introduction on kind of what incrementality is and how we calculate it. Aurelian, I wanted to kind of
let me just jump in on that, because I think, when we were originally thinking of how to tackle this problem, we have this problem like everybody else does, which is when you look at, if you add up everything that people tell you they're giving you, and you look at your business, you're like, why are you guys telling me that you're giving me $10 million of business when in the period or whatever, I'm only selling in total 6, and like that sort of stuff. A lot of other companies that we considered and did, but this was years ago, this was 6 years ago. Interesting, they were using a very theoretical approach, and they would be like, oh, well, I'm going to model it out and I'll give you just an answer. But what that did was, it wasn't really where we wanted to go. And the interesting thing about measured was that on top of that, they actually measured the answer as well, right? And I think that's why the company's called Measured, although maybe not. I'd have to ask Trevor, their CEO. But this idea of doing a geo holdout test or something and actually looking for places, looking what's happening where you're doing it and looking where it doesn't do. And it sort of appeals to me because I don't like the word testing very much anyway. I always think about the word of comparison more in the company. And this idea of a geo holdout test is really like, let me compare where I'm not running it to where I am running it. And then you can quite quickly see how the learning comes. And so that's essentially what, the way I see this platform. But
yeah, that's a great segue. I mean, one of the common things that we see is CMOs and CFOs often disagree with each other about the value of media, and the fundamental reason is something to do with what you just said earlier, right? A platform, whether it's Google Analytics or all the different media platforms, report one thing, and that doesn't usually seem to line up with what we're seeing, on the business side, right? And so, we actually find it measured, about 40%, 42% of marketing campaigns on average are not incremental. And the problem is, what 40% is that? And unless you're really testing and measuring it, you can't actually answer that question. And so, really, I would love to get your perspective. If you rewind the clock to say, 2019 or 2020, before you were working with Measured, what were your biggest challenges, and maybe how did you realize that you had a problem from a measurement standpoint?
well, and look, over the years, I mean, this has been an ongoing channel, and we went to the extent for a while, like, we took one of our markets. This is quite a long time, and this is probably a decade ago, but we took one of our markets and we just switched off all Google spend because we just didn't believe it at all. And especially you have to remember, like, Dermalogica is a professional brand, right? So we do professional skincare. If anybody here likes skincare, both men and women, you need to be using daily microfoliant. Just a quick plug there. But and so a lot of our clients, the consumers who use our products will have been recommended by therapists, professional skincare therapy. They get a treatment. At the end of the treatment, somebody says, hey, these are the products you should be using. That leads to a place where you have a lot of organic traffic, right? Those people probably buy that the first time at the skin therapist, maybe even the second time. But some of those people eventually will be saying, look, I just want to replenish and let me just go and get it. Now, those people are on a replenishment mission, whether or not you're advertising to them. They're going to come either find us here or find us somewhere else, at our own store. And you can see how like Google and the other people love to insert themselves. And it's basically as though you had a shop on a strip mall, and the advertising campaign stands itself right in front of the door, and anybody and starts taking credit for anybody walking through that door. And so that's how we started. And and you can see that as well in our numbers. So like our proportion of organic traffic to our websites was quite a large proportion compared to other websites, and to other brands. And so it sort of kept on telling us what we're saying. We're just paying for people who are coming anyway. And that's where it is. And so then we sort of started looking and finding and found obviously a way to sort of more systematically address this problem, which is the person who's coming to me today, is that really an incremental person? And if it is, I'm willing to lean in and I really want to, I'm willing to spend on them. And if they're not new, maybe I'll still spend a bit, make sure I don't get forgotten, but I'm spending a lot less because I could basically hit them up with an email as well, right?
So it's fundamentally understanding and only paying for the people who need media to convert and not those who are otherwise already planning to do so. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's sort of, yeah. Look, inherently I'm cheap, right? I mean, I don't know if that's good as a CEO or not, but we, if I want to have this whole system work well, I need to be able to make profits in certain parts, so I can pay for the investment in R&D and all the other things we want to invest in and expand the brand. And so it's sort of the idea of giving all huge budgets to people whose incentives aren't aligned with us, right? I think that's one of the biggest issues, right? The Facebooks and Meta and Google, their incentive is to get as much money out of my pocket and into their pocket. And I get it. And they've realized that the best way of doing that is doing stuff like, telling people that they've got a really high ROAS, really high return on ad spend. And and then that leads to this fiction, right? It's like, oh, you got to, for every dollar you give me, I'm giving you $5 back, give me more dollars. But I don't really want to be celebrating that. I don't want my ROAS to go higher and higher. I want my sales to go higher and higher. And that's what I care about. I care about my incremental sales, not what ROAS, and I don't want to celebrate ROAS.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll come back to this point in particular. A CEO can allocate, financial resources in a lot of ways, hiring people, product, research and development, media. We'll talk later on about how you maybe use measured to align on your hurdle
Yeah.
rate or benchmark or what you would expect, media to do to justify investment there versus all the other ways
Yeah.
that you can do that. But looking at a real example here, and so this is just sample data. This is not Dermalogica data. Um, what the fundamental problem is here, if you look at some of these tactics, you have a platform reported ROAS number and an incremental ROAS number. Many people are stuck making decisions on the platform number, or if it's not platform, it's Google Analytics, or it's some other methodology that tends to be biased in some way or another. What we've found here is that oftentimes, if you rely on that, you're actually making the opposite decision that you should be to
Mm.
actually move the needle for the business. And so there are certain things like PMAX, in this case here, not always the case. What's reported at a 3.4 platform ROAS, actually on an incremental basis is only at 1.2. Whereas meta prospecting, you can see, is actually not as far off. And so if you're trying to understand where is the next dollar I should allocate or how should I shuffle my budget, relying purely on the platform number will lead you to a different decision than you would make
That, yeah,
overall.
because the incentives are they're particularly bad if you want to grow your business, right? Because the platform, the platform is overstating the ROAS. So what does that make you do? It makes you put all your money with a high ROAS product, with the high ROAS activities, and that's your existing customer. And so you're spending all your money because because your marketing team is chasing this high ROAS number, but actually that means that they're just really often going into retargeting. And and so then, so you imagine if your goal is to grow your brand and to grow your entire business, you're spending way too much time sort of on existing customers and not nearly enough on new customers, and that can get quite unhealthy quite quickly.
Yeah, those are all great points. I think in the last several years too, I mean, we've had some really disruptive events. There's been COVID, iOS 14.5, the release of things like Performance Max or Advantage shopping campaigns. The question about TikTok and whether or not that's going to be, just wondering like how has the measured platform helped you kind of cut through all that noise and actually understand where and how should we invest in the middle of these really dramatic changes on a macro level
Mm.
that may or may not actually be impacting incremental performance of media?
Well, look, I think, for me, Measure does, yeah, it does the actual tests. Um, so that, the three reasons we use Measured. One of them is it does tests and works out, is it incremental, is it not? Secondly, it's a data hub. And thirdly, it provides guidance and consulting, sort of, so to speak, to sort of for these big life-changing events, like iOS 14.5, for example. I think, when you start thinking about um, sort of difficult times when, like, for example, when suddenly with the iOS change, basically some of your customers you couldn't recognize and all these sort of things, you need really a hub where you get all your data together. And and for me at least, I want to see what my total budgets, I want to know what my total spend is. I don't want it, and for maybe for an internal business, the setup, which we do, because we're talking about it, I've got like 1,500 people in the company, right? It's not like just one person controls all the media. That's not a good setup. I've got brand marketeers, I've got co-op marketeers, I've got DTC marketeers. But if I want to put it and understand what's happening with the platform change and all these sort of things, I need this all to go together in one hub. And the way this is basically, this has got connectors to all of them, to Google, to Meta, to CTV, to whatever, and all of that stuff comes together. So literally on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, I can sort of say, okay, and there's a beautiful chart and says, okay, this is exactly what you're spending, and then this is what you're seeing. And on these big change events, you can see, is it working, right? Is it working? Is it staying at the level it was, or is it coming down? And and it's those sort of things that sort of help me. I mean, look at we're living in quite turbulent times, right? Without getting political here, I mean, for an export-led American business, it's not been a good 2 weeks, right? It's like sort of I got retaliation in many countries against my products and all that sort of thing. And I've got consumer sentiment changing quite significantly. But I don't want to stop spending, right? I can't just sort of say, oh, yeah, the world's difficult, I'm going to pull back. So I need to be even more. It's really important that I know exactly at what point does it make financial sense and at what point doesn't it make its financial sense. Most of the time, I'm targeting an incremental ROAS of like 1.4, 1.5. And even if the world changes, as long as I know I got good data and it's still at 1.42, you know what? I'm going to keep leaning in, and I want to lean in more because I need to spend more, maybe even at these times. And I've got some big plans to spend a lot more this year than I have before. But I need to have that. I have to see that, And if didn't have that visibility, I would be suddenly rolling the dice in ways that, would start making me scared. And when you're scared, you don't lean forward, right? And that's what I don't want to have happen.
Yeah, those are all great thoughts. And it's a good segue into a broader conversation about incrementality really is not just a media thing, right? I mean, it broadly changes the way that you would run an entire organization. I mean, it comes from the top. It's a fundamentally different set of decisions you make if you look at Google Analytics versus measured, for example. and that changes the way that you would approach potentially incentivizing teams or agencies or allocating budget. You mentioned earlier, right? You can invest in R&D or you can invest in media.
Mm,
Um, I would love to understand, like, how has incrementality as a concept influenced the business beyond, I mean, media is obviously the core of it, but how has it influenced
yeah.
the way that you think about the entire business and you get the global team speaking the same language and accessing the same data set? Or if you travel around the world to visit
Mm.
different markets, you don't have someone, presenting one metric versus
So,
another. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on a broader, like, CEO
yeah,
of incrementality.
there's a couple of ways that look, you can delegate your marketing spend to your marketing department or your e-commerce department, depending on how you're set up. And you can do that, but that's generally a budget level thing, right? It happens once a year. You do it in the summer, and then everybody's like, okay, you got your budget. They've got their budget. They go, and you trust your teams to optimize it, and they will optimize it. The question is, let's say there's a life-changing event and you need to adjust. At that point, you suddenly need finance to be in it as well, right? Because that now we're talking about, you're three months through, 4 months through the year, and you want to actually fundamentally change the way your budgeting works. Everybody's now needs to have a bit of an opinion and have to be on the same suite, the same level. So by having a tool whereby finance can see it as well and sort of say, hey, this makes sense, right? I can see that. I can see what the attributed incremental revenue is. I can see what you're spending, what everybody's spending across a variety of places. It just makes it easier and those step changes. Um, but it's also, look, I mean, in many things, I mean, we might come back to this later, but I think, you have to think where you get your information from. My favorite reviews, in everything I do in the business, I like dashboard-led reviews. Um, so, you know, my idea is not that somebody goes into a platform, gets some numbers out, types them into Excel, makes some crappy chart out of the Excel numbers, takes a screenshot of that and puts it into PowerPoint. To start with, that's wholly inefficient. Wholly inefficient. And the moment you're sitting in a meeting like that and you want to drill down on something, there's like, oh, I'll get back to you next week. And if you want an update on that, oh, well, then you've only got that data for until the end of March. What about the last 2 weeks? They're like, oh, I have to do all the work again. With Measured and with other dashboard tools that we use, like, you have that real time, you bring it all together. It's just easy, right? It's like there's a number at the bottom of the page tells you what your total spend is. I'm not, regularly needing to go into like Facebook Ad Manager, Google Ad Manager, TikTok, all these other platforms, and especially, and to try and just understand what have I done, and could there maybe be an intercorrelation between things?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, like e-commerce and media in particular, there's a million different metrics you can use, and you could probably make any campaign sound amazing if you pick and choose the right metric. And I'm curious for you, like, how does having a single metric, incremental ROAS, for you make that conversation easier between Canadian or French or German or American
Yeah.
teams, different priorities?
Yeah, for a while I kept on getting PowerPoint. People would like, oh, it's just like, I don't know. It's in the influencer world, people were like, oh, I spent $10,000 or $100,000 on this influencer event. And if I add up all the followers of all the people, the influencers who are at the event, I have a reach of 250 million. I'm like, are you telling me that everybody in the States saw the ad twice? I'm like, no, right? It's not right. It's just not true. So I get worried when people sort of get it. And there's marketing people also, most of the marketing people we hire, they're great creatively. They've got something special about them. They can think, they know their consumer. They're not necessarily mathematically minded quite as much as other people in the organization, right? Sometimes they can be, but sometimes they're not as and so having sort of a language that they feel comfortable with, and look, an incremental ROAS is quite, ROAS means basically, whatever. You spend $1, how much do you get back in sales, right? Not profits, it's in sales. An incremental is like how much is that, how you spend $1 and how much extra sale did you get? That's all it is, right? So that's something that everybody can get towards. And it sort of normalizes the numbers. So when I now, in the before that in the presentations I would see, somebody would do something on an extreme, basically on it was getting quite close to retargeting, and they would celebrate that it was a $7 ROAS. I don't like high ROASs. I don't want a $7 ROAS because probably it means you're just hitting the target, the person who was walking through the door. I'm with an incremental ROAS. Even that one, actually, I don't get that excited when it's high. I get more excited when when you keep it at the level you want and you just push as hard as you can, right? Again, because my job is to what we're trying in the company is to make sure that the more people using our products because they're wonderful products. So that's what I want to see. And so it's helped change the discussion with marketers from saying, the semi-financial thing, which is, oh, I gave you 4 times back your money, to this is what the incremental ROAS was. And it's good. And I managed to push this much into it. And actually, I think I can scale it further, which is, the sort of discussion I would like to have.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We actually just got a question in the Q&A here to you. Is incremental ROAS your most important KPI? And if not, what is?
Yeah, it's definitely not my most important because the problem with incremental ROAS, I like KPIs that people have to increase, right? Like, I don't know. Yeah, it's like sales. It's pretty obvious that I'm happier if I got more sales than low sales. I'm not happier if I've got a higher incremental ROAS. I peg my incremental ROAS at a number that I am comfortable with, and then I want to see how much I can push through that. And it's like that's what I want. I don't know. And if I start putting a KPI of the incremental ROAS, for me, it's dangerous because people come to like it sort of suggests that I would be happier if it was 2.5 than if it was 1.5. And that's not true. You should have doubled down and you should have actually said you had more healthy spend that you could have done. And you should have done that. And then that will have maximized your sales. So look, I mean, we have different KPIs in the company, but the number of new accounts I've opened, the number of, the proportion of my most important product and things like that. But when it comes to the DTC spend, um, the incremental sales, how important incremental sales as a proportion of my total business is one of the ones I look at.
Yeah.
It's like,
So the goal is to grow the business. Incremental ROAS is a means, it's a KPI that's important to understand, but it is not what you're optimizing the business to.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Makes sense. Yeah. Let's talk now more holistically, about, measurement and holistic measurement. One of the key benefits here is you talk about bringing together different data sources. We have a media mix model component. We have the incrementality test results. We have the platform data from, the various platforms here. This all comes together and we're starting now to look across sales channels a bit, right? E-com versus Amazon versus retail.
Yeah.
I'm curious how has this improved the way that you're starting to think about, the role of media more broadly within an organization, over a longer period of time? I kind of open
Yeah,
it.
the interesting thing that we're seeing now is like trying to sort of expand, and we're working with Measure to expand that our knowledge is not just what, when we do advertising, not just what it does on our DTC, but what it does on our other channels. And I think that's quite an exciting sort of fundamental change. And again, you can do that with geo holdout testing and such. So that's quite an exciting part of it. And once you start thinking of, realize, because everybody's always known that things are interconnected, but the difficulty is not knowing exactly how much things are interconnected. I mean, a very quick example would be, if I do a TikTok spend, it's not as obvious it's not, you know, that spend, there's not really a link to click. Somebody has to go to a website or go place and buy. So actually the interconnectedness of TikTok and Amazon is actually quite high. Whereas let's say a lower funnel Google campaign, a lot of the people who execute on that will just click the link and move further. And so that would be so the interconnectedness to Amazon is less. So, understanding where you would expect to see and trying to model that out, I think is one of these big things. And I think that media mix modeling sort of helps that a bit, and supplements the measurable incrementality comparisons that we do. And, is also then informed by what the platform says.
Great. Yeah, totally agree, and excited to continue to work with you on that. We're going to talk about some specific Dermalogica, insights and impacts as like a mini case study here. But I think in
Mm,
summary of what we've talked about, we feel very strongly about incrementality. You clearly have brought this into your organization. At Measured, what we found is that amongst clients who have self-reported to us that they've adopted incrementality into their organization
mm,
in the way that you talked about, where it becomes like really the way that they make decisions around media investment. We've seen
mhm,
18% increase in sales lift and contribution from media as a result. And so
mhm,
clearly, across our clients who really buy into this, it clearly works. I think some of the things that you've said here, consistent media metrics, based on a dashboard, having a centralized place to access it, aligning marketing and finance, giving actionable, insights for the team to act on are all really important. Does one of these stand out to you as being maybe the most important aspect, or maybe
Um,
something else we didn't mention here?
Look, I'm a fundamental believer that like senior managers need to understand how things work if they're going to affect it. Either you're like as a CEO or as a senior manager, you're just a passenger on the train that is the company, or you're the driver. And if you want to be the driver and the innovator, you have to understand how it goes. And maybe not on a daily basis, be building it yourself. So this idea of having a place where you can have confidence, again, it's pretty easy, right? It's one place, everything's feeding into it, and you can look in, and you do look in, right? That's a big part of it because otherwise, I think, a lot of areas, executives don't always have the time to go to the dashboards. They go to a presentation, they see a snapshot here, a snapshot there, and they don't really know how it fits together. So that's one of these big things that allows it. And I guess that links to the insights, the actionable insights. It makes for a very different conversation when you're like, okay, this is how much we spent in total. This is what we spent there, and this, yeah, well, your TikTok and your eyebrows, I know it's going to be lower, but according to this, it's way lower than the benchmark. Can we have a conversation about that? That's an actionable discussion, right? Where I'm not taking over the role of the people, the very capable people who run that for us, but I'm sort of questioning, and and that's those are the sort of jobs that I need to do, and what my role is sort of asking people the questions that sort of need to be uncovered.
Yeah. Great, makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about how you put this into practice and some of the great results that you've seen over the years. So we talked a lot about some of your challenges, right? You had this untrustworthy
Mm,
media data. You weren't really sure where to spend based on the conflicting information you were seeing.
mm,
Historically, before Measured, you would have test results or insights from other types of things that would sort of be topical for 30 minutes and then go off and die
yeah.
in an email somewhere. Um, so I know one of the key things that you're really trying to do in the last couple of years was how do we increase our spend and increase the efficiency of that spend through better budget allocation. And um, you know, everything that we talked about today played out into what I would say is a pretty rigorous test and
Mhm,
learn mindset and culture within Dermalogica. So if you look at last year versus the 2 years prior, kind of coming out of COVID,
mm,
when things like PMAX and ASC really started to ramp up, and there are these sort of new campaigns that at face value seemed amazing. And
mhm,
as they first rolled out, marketers weren't really sure what to do with them, right? You just sort of set it up and without really realizing that if you don't make any changes, it will work in Google or Facebook's advantage to sell media efficiently, but it may not
Mm.
align to incremental metrics. And so, one great example of how we worked with the team to understand these things in particular was over a 2-year period, consistently tested these tactics in particular. We took learnings from those tests, we made changes, we sort of monitored performance for a bit, validated with another test, and sort of rinsed and repeated that cycle. And what we found is over a couple of years here, spend was able to consistently increase, which is the orange line here,
Yeah.
over time, while also increasing the incremental ROAS. And so, each one of these, over time, it was sort of represents a learning that was made and implemented. And you can see the results here, spend up 400%, ROAS up almost 200% here. Not typical, right? Typically, as you spend more, the ROAS will start to come down, but your team leveraged these insights in a really powerful way. And I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, look, I mean, start with the up to sort of, the platforms, Google, the others. The reason they introduced PMAX and ASC, again, I have to think of why did they do that, and it was like, well, it's another way of taking more money out of you, right? At that point, particularly, they were trying to kick out the agencies who are the intermediaries with the idea if the agency is taking a fee and people know how to do it, can do it themselves, they probably will then spend all that extra agency money and all the agency fee on extra advertising, and then Google Meta win again. They also screw around a bit with as when everybody after iOS 14.5 started realizing that because some of the returns that you started seeing on the platform were actually becoming more realistic, everybody's like, oh my God, I shouldn't be investing anymore because I'm losing money. They just started changing the metrics again, right? They're literally screwing around. It's like being in Vegas where the person can change the one-arm bandit and like on how many times it pays out. And so you need something sort of more standardized and having the confidence that you're actually going on the right path. But yeah, this is it. I mean, you do see, the blues going up because at the beginning, the blue, which is incremental ROAS, was a bit too low, right? But then, when you start seeing the investment later, you're sort of saying it's actually staying closer to where we want it to be, right? And it's not trying to get that as high as possible. But whilst we're doing that, you see the other curve go up. So that's the idea, right? You keep that at the level you want, and you sort of try and keep pushing up. Um, and on an overall, just I don't know from you guys, from most people, but like the idea of putting a chart like this together with any sort of resolution for your spend and what it came back from your spend, this is not coming out of an ERP system, right? An ERP system, you'd have to download 3 sets of what were my 2022 results, 23, 24, then somebody's putting in Excel and whatever. It's just like miserable. So this is sort of and then also with something that you could drill down and put filters on, which I love as well in these sort of things. I like, okay, you show me this for those campaigns, but show me this entire graph just for Meta, or just for this Meta tactics group of tactics, or just for CTV. How does that look, right? And those sort of things, those are the sort of ones where you're like, okay, visually, I can see what's happening in the world. And that's why I know, I know what I need to do.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, we're not saying that PMAX and ASC are bad. They're powerful tools that you need to point in the
Yeah.
right direction for your business, right? There's a lot of great technology that you can leverage, but you need to realize that if you just
Yeah, and we were very reticent to start with them because basically they were taking the possibility and the control away from us, which where we could say how much is retargeting and how much is prospecting. What we found, but with repeated campaigns and repeated geo holdout tests, we found the right combination of what level of, what we need to do on the basically the configuration settings in the background to make it a profitable thing and make it better than what used to be there. But it took several rounds of getting there and sort of realizing, okay, at this point my incrementality is too low, even if the numbers look good. And at some point you got the right measure between this is my incrementality and this is my return, and those are good numbers. And so that's where I want to push forward.
yeah, I think the other thing too is having incremental ROAS as a framework for you gave you more confidence to actually establish a different target for upper funnel, right? I mean, brand
Yeah.
awareness, TV. I know historically you had struggled to understand, should I invest there at all? I don't see any impact. But you started to build a more holistic framework. If I know that I can get a 2 incremental ROAS at a bottom funnel campaign, I'm fine with 50 cent or $1 at the top because it's a healthier mix overall for us. And you started to lean into that. And I don't know if you have any
Yeah.
comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when you start seeing like this isn't just bottom funnel, this is top funnel as well. And when you do top funnel things, you should see something, but like when you do top funnel things, it's as though you generate something, you generate a bit of dust, but then there's somebody who has to sweep up the dust and turn it to gold, that sort of thing. And so it's that combination of the generating and sweeping up, which happens at the same time. And you should be able to see that in the overall aggregate. And that's what that's what we look for. But it is clearly, you I think sometimes people get worried about incremental or ROAS and returns on top funnel because they somehow think that people are going to say, well, it's only a 20 cent on the dollar return. You're going to switch it off. So therefore we shouldn't be talking about this. That's not the way I see it. I was like, we should be talking. And if it's only a $20, 20 cent on the dollar, we still want to do it. I prefer to have our eyes open and just be happy. I'm happy to do this amount of money at 20 cents as long as I have a whole bunch of stuff that's working at 3 and the mix gives me, my 1.5, 2 that I'm happy with.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. I think the summary here is really powerful. So this, the combination of the, optimization of the mid to low funnel plus that more broader holistic target approach had some really great results. In the last couple of years, you guys doubled your spend overall. You almost doubled your upper funnel spend, and we saw incremental ROAS increase by 24%. And that's really atypical. Normally, as you spend more, the ROAS will decrease, but you use this framework to some really great effect,
Yeah.
and you increase your spend and you increase your efficiency and directly impacted
Now, I
overall.
would say that maybe some good products, good launches,
Yes.
some good work by the team may have had something to do with it as well. But definitely, it does show how we've been able to leave. And look, I'm a physicist by training, so I'm a bit nerdy and stuff. So, and being cheap as well, you can imagine that there's a lot of hesitation with some of these things and knowing where we come from as an organically heavy company. But being able to do this in a very systematic way and continuing, it's not like I said, it's a really crazy time at the moment, but we're going to lean in more rather than less because we're feeling comfortable that we can measure, where we are and how it's working.
Yeah, I think marketing will never fix the product market fit, right? I mean, you have to have that fundamental piece to grow, but if you manage it well on top of the more important product market fit component and having a great product, if you manage it well, it can be fuel to the fire that can be
Yeah.
really powerful. And so yeah, I agree completely with that. We'll have Q&A here in a second. I think there's just a few summaries of, actions today that executives can take. I think the first is challenge the platform reported ROAS numbers, especially for, the AI type campaigns. PMax, ASC, Performance Plus on Pinterest is another one. I think all of these platforms are moving in that direction. So, don't take them at face value. Embrace testing to ground your decisions in what actually moves the business and doesn't simply look great in a given platform. 3 is set specific financial goals to an incremental ROAS metric, right? You define as a CEO, you can allocate budget in a lot of ways, tie it to an incremental metric to the point where you're happy
Can
to,
I can I
yeah,
jump in on that? Because I think that might also be one of the questions I sort of seen picked out, which is this question of how does this tie into the profitability goals of your company? So the
yeah,
way I see it, so you have your iROAS target, which is a really good thing you can do day in, day out. You then have, like, depending on your setup, you probably have some of your marketing going to your DTC channel, some of your marketing going, let's say, to brand building marketing department. You have your DTC and your own website profitability of that channel that we also have targets for. And we sort of make sure that, okay, of the section, let's say, whatever, 2/3 of that brand spend is going to be allocated to this channel because that's where who's spending it. And when that's in there, this is the profitability I expect of that channel. And so what we do on a global basis is try and make sure, we check it occasionally that what, it's a one-off exercise though, is say what ROAS is going to be happy for you. What is your iROAS that's going to be good for your brand? It based on your cost of goods and the cost of all the commissions and whoever you have to pay and all that sort of stuff. And so then we tie that together. And then, and so we know that if we work out there, that it'll be okay over here. And we look at both of them and then make sure they continue to work.
Yeah, makes total sense. And then finally, I think just embedding incrementality into executive thinking and quarterly planning cycles. It is not a media only consideration. It is not a once a year consideration. It is something that you should really be thinking about continuously as you make these types of decisions. So I think those are my takeaways. Really, I don't know if you have anything else that you would add here in summary that really stands out.
Look, I think, there's different brands have got different needs. I mean, the idea, and so I think sort of understanding if, incremental, you're worried about new customers. If you're plainly, look, you're so new and you've got no repeat customers for some reason because of your business model, not sure that I would spend a lot of time thinking about incrementality, because probably incrementality is 98% whatever, and you can tell, right? If you turned off all your advertising tomorrow and your sales go down to 1%, I don't think you probably got something else you want to work on before spending money on incrementality. Um, but if that's not the case, and you turn everything off tomorrow and your sales continue at some sort of level that's significant, that's sort of that maybe is the indicator that you sort of need to be careful that you're not paying for people coming anyway.
Yeah, and the bigger the business gets, the bigger that question becomes, right? If the higher stake, turning off all media for $100 million business is a much riskier proposition than a
Yes.
$1 million business, right? And so you need to be very confident, one, that
Yeah.
you're not going to disrupt the entire business in a like a deadly way, and two,
Yeah.
just understanding how do you scale as you have brand awareness building, how can you?
That's an interesting thing. I often see that from the marketers as well, is that, you know, you, from outside, you're like, well, that's not working. When you switch that off and when you switch that on, you can actually see some hesitancy by the people managing the media budgets, because they're like, well, if I do that, will I make my target this month, this week, whatever? And you see that hesitancy. And so, having tools where people are feeling more confident is a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another executive support to encourage this type of testing, right? Having a testing mindset where there is some short-term cost that has a much longer term benefit that outweighs
Yeah.
it, is really important. And so I think this has all been great. I know we have a few questions here.
Mhm.
I think mostly for you, really. And the first one, are you planning to cut spend due to tariffs? How will global economic uncertainty influence your marketing strategy over the next 6 to 12 months?
No, no, look, I don't, no, the tariffs are not something that's going to cause me to cut spend. It probably cause us to put, there's going to be price increases coming, even for an expert, there's small amount of components that get sourced from other countries, and those are getting all hit, right? So my cost base is going up, which is a real issue. And then so I have to respond, and I have to, I can eat some of it, but some of it is going to have to go to the consumer. So that's going to cause price increases. And I think I'd see in our industry, I think a lot of those price increases will come in by the summer. With, so, but at the same time, the spend, I, especially in a difficult market, you want to make sure, for some reason, some ways you need to have to, you want to invest even more because you need the sales, right? You've got targets you're trying to make, you want to go and you want to lean in. But I think leaning out and saying, oh, I'm going to just exit the market, it's just going to exacerbate a very difficult thing where consumer sentiment might be hit. So I definitely think I'm leaning in. It's hard to say what I'm going to do over the next 6 to 12 months because the administration makes, whatever I answer today, the administration may change its mind within 3 days. So I've got rough ideas of where we'll go, but I prefer to make sure I've got the flexibility. We keep a cool head. I've got good visibility of what's happening, then I'm fine, right? I'm not in charge of everything else in the world. So rather than trying to, predicting the future doesn't seem to be a very healthy thing and useful thing. I'll spend lots of time that's not, that end up being wasteful when the assumptions I make are probably not right.
Yeah, and I think actually cutting spend is something that we see in a lot of cases. Either business is down or some target gets missed, and it's usually the first thing that gets cut is media, and usually it's the upper funnel media that gets cut because people don't properly understand how to value it. And
Mm.
if you have a platform like Measured in place, like you can actually understand exactly that when you make those cuts, you may actually be harming the business because that spend directly drives revenue or profit. And longer term, if you cut upper funnel, what's going to happen is the mid or low funnel may just stop working at some point. And so,
So yes, that's very true. And I've seen examples of that in business over the years where they had a driver, they didn't realize it didn't really make financial sense as much as it used to. They switched off the driver and suddenly the whole business starts going. So now they're in this awful cycle where they keep moving down, right? Because
yeah,
what we're trying to do is show things work so we can put more money in, so we grow more so that it works even better. So you want that flywheel to be going the right direction, not reverse, and sort of understanding it. But part of that making sure the flywheel's turning at all is also making sure that your top of funnel is actually doing something, right? Not all top of funnel works.
yes,
People are doing Super Bowl ads which make no sense whatsoever. Um, and then make a t-shirt to sort of to celebrate it. That's not really my way of thinking, but that idea of sort of making sure that you're doing all the things that are good. Because the long term in the end is a series of short terms, right?
yes, exactly. I was just going to say that too. I mean, you can make a short-term decision that is fine for this quarter, but if that brings in a cohort of purchasers that never buy again, you'll be paying for that decision for 6 or 12
Mm.
or 18 months, and you have to flush that out. And it can
Yeah, I
be
see a lot of our growth, and our growth now is a lot about what did I do 4 or 5 months ago, right?
exactly
Yeah,
just
that's often true.
yeah, great. Another question. Any advice for marketers struggling to align finance and marketing? I think you are sort of in the 99th percentile of thinking like
I would suggest that I would suggest they go out, have a boozy evening and make a lot of bad decisions and get to know each other better. So it's probably an interpersonal thing that I'd recommend first. Look, it's also good to sort of understand, I think understand one another's jobs, not in terms of trying to sort of second guess. It's dangerous, especially in difficult times and in companies that are maybe not going through, or a section of the company that's not going very well. What I often find is a teller is if I've got marketing telling, sort of making a presentation about telling me what sales should be doing, and sales telling me what education should be doing, and maybe education telling me what finance should be doing, and vice versa, and finance telling me what marketing's doing. That's a dynamic you want to break. And
yeah,
so, people have to be in their lane and do what they do, but you have to know what the others are. So, if you're seeing that dynamic, and maybe between finance thinking that should be telling marketing what they should be doing and vice versa, somehow I would suggest that you try and move people back both into their lanes and that both sides understand each other. And if you combine that with a couple of boozy dinners, they'd probably be good.
nice. There's a question here about how you backed into the incremental ROAS targets. I think you kind of answer this, how you tie it to profitability. Is that just understanding
Yeah.
the
I mean,
bid, return
we've
rate?
now done a very theoretical way of working it out. Okay, I mean, sell this. What's my gross margin, and how do I work that out? It's not that difficult, It's but originally, actually, the way we did it, as I wasn't sure what it was, so I just picked a number out of the air and then ran it for 3 months and saw if the company was going off a cliff or not, and it wasn't. So I was like, okay, I'm probably roughly right, right? Later, we then, used a bit of more science to sort of say, oh, let's push it up a bit or push it down a bit. But, you can't, don't go for one,
Yeah,
right? Because you haven't covered your cost of goods. Don't go for four. That seems really unlikely on an incremental basis, right? So it's going to be, somewhere between.
Yeah, that's a good point. Executive leadership here. I mean, this is a new way of thinking for a lot of people, and it requires someone to push this into the organization, be willing to make a change.
Hmm.
One final question here. I think that's maybe more for measured. If you can't do geo holdouts, what are other ways that you can measure incremental ROAS? There are in-platform lift tests you can employ. There are audience-based holdouts you can do on things like direct mail or email. If you're a smaller brand that has a simpler media mix, what Aurelian mentioned around larger tests where you simply turn off media more broadly. It's a crude way to do it, but it can kind of get you backed into an answer. Also just simply looking at as you increase spend, how does the business respond, right? If you see the business doubles when you double your spend, you get a good understanding of what that relationship is. Um, there
There's
are other ways to do it.
there's a question here about how do you get your team to be passionate media measure evangelists might be a fun, I think one of the things that you have to realize is that, marketing and sales are interesting. In sales, you get this. You make a sale, somebody says, yes, congratulations, I want to buy. You have that satisfaction. Most marketeers are missing that satisfaction in life, right? They never can do work and then like literally have somebody like it's very clear there's a big tick goes off and they go home at night and say, well, that was amazing. Once you start getting into media measurement, you start getting that for the first time. So they're not just making campaigns hoping that it's okay and it's good campaign if the boss says it's good and it's not a good campaign if the boss doesn't like it. And they move over a bit more into the sales territory where they're getting a nice pat on the back. It's amazing how much the pat on the back to a group makes people really exciting and like, oh yeah, let me do my next campaign. I wonder what number I'm going to get. And it just helps them. It doesn't start meaning that they change their world, but it's a pat on the back that they've never had before, which is quite cool.
Yeah, you've done some fun stuff with like global leaderboards, I think, in different markets and having
Yeah, yeah.
Zomo.
Yeah, we sort of do the leaderboard. Like, that's a good one, especially when you've got decentralized business and markets. You sort of, who's we celebrate the people at the top, but the people who are in the bottom look at that as well, and they're like, yeah, I don't want to be there. I want to move up.
And I know you've had contests in the past where you're offering extra budget and you say, you guys can compete for this budget. Whoever puts the best incremental plan in place will win extra dollars to drive their business. I think that's a version of what you were saying. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Those contests were interesting as well because people would lean in, and then suddenly it was a really good way for best practice sharing because people realized that, okay, and as I'm leaning in and I need to do this to get the money, um, oh my God, it's not quite working. Why is it? And then they find out, and it's another way to cascade global best practice when you have multiple markets, running in different languages and doing different things. So you have separate teams running it, but you've got this common thread. Mm.
Great. Great. Well, thanks for the time here. We just to wrap up, we have a few resources for anyone who's interested. Feel free to reach out to us, info@measure.com. We're always happy to chat about this. Any questions you have about incrementality, testing, resources around this stuff. We have a couple resources here in the chat that we shared. The case study that we talked about with Dermalogica, and then a modern media mix model guide, which is how we use MMM plus testing together. So please feel free to reach out. Aurelian, thank you very much for the time. This has
Oh,
been
sure.
really phenomenal. I know you're busy. Appreciate the time, and I'm sure that the audience loved it.
All right. Thanks.
Great.
Enjoy. Have a good day.
Yep. Bye.